Okay, hello and welcome everyone. So my name is Julia Plaxina. I'm a marketing manager in Refinitiv, and I will help my colleagues from Agriculture Research team to coordinate today's webinar. The topic of our today's webinar is Europe and Black Sea grain production and trading outlooks. And again, thank you for joining us today. So before we move to the main part of our webinar, to presentation itself, I would like to cover a few housekeeping points. So first of all, at the bottom of your webinar screen, you should see a toolbar. If you would like to get an access to such application as webinar materials or technical support or completing a survey, please click on the icon. So all applications on your screen are resizable and movable. So also, if you have questions to our speakers, you can submit your questions using Q&A box, and our speakers will try to answer all your questions at the end of the webinar. A recording of this webinar will be sent within upcoming days to your emails. And we really value your feedback, so please complete a survey which you can see on your right screen of the, which you can see on the right side of your screen. Thank you again, everyone, for joining, and over to my colleague, Libin. Thank you.
Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar. I'm Libin Zhou, Agricultural Research Manager at Refinitiv. Here we wanted to discuss 2021-22 greens production and trading analysis. Before we start the webinar, I wanted to briefly introduce Refinitiv Agricultural Research. We provide independent analysis on crop area, yield, production, and weather insight for analysis. This map just shows the coverage of crops and geographies by Refinitiv Agricultural Research. We also monitor global agricultural commodity trade flows, focusing on import-exports from country to country. This is a screenshot of the interactive map in Icon. Through this app, you can easily track individual vessel and find out its current location, past checks, what it's carrying on its destination, and all other information. Our supply and demand analysis was conducted based on our crop production forecast and the trade flow analysis. Here's the agenda for today's webinar. Isaac, my colleague Isaac, will introduce Europe and the Black Sea region summer weather outlook. Then I will introduce greens production forecast and the supply and demand outlooks. At the end, my colleague Worship will discuss trade flows in Middle East and Africa. So I'll hand it over to Isaac.
Thank you, Libin. And excited to be here sharing some Europe and Black Sea summer outlooks. The weather, the summer is underway there, and the weather is already interesting. So we'll take a look at our picture as a whole, our forecast for the summer, and then some shorter-term trends. How are things developing early in the summer? How does it line up with or differ from the big picture that we had for the whole summer? And then maybe some helpful tools that you can use to monitor trends for what may be likely from this point forward, just on a week-by-week basis. So without further delay, I'll get into the forecast. So this is our Europe and Black Sea region summer outlook. This will be the June through August outlook overall, temperature and precipitation. And so what I'll be showing with all the maps that I showed today, you'll see blue shading corresponding to cool temperatures relative to normal. Red on the map is going to be warm temperatures relative to normal. And then on precipitation, you'll see green shaded areas or enclosed areas as high rainfall expected, and then brown shading or enclosed areas as dryness expected in the forecast. So that's the overall way to interpret all the maps that I will be sharing. And looking at our summer forecast for the region, you can see that the heat risks we expect this summer to be strongest over the Black Sea region around Ukraine and southern Russia, with potentially cooler temperatures both to the east across Russia and also to the west across northern Europe or Western Europe. And then looking at the rainfall pattern, we do expect an area of above normal rainfall right around Central Europe, including portions of Western Europe over to Eastern Europe, kind of right in the middle, with dryness risks to the far west in Europe and also across the Black Sea region, this time a little bit farther east, focused more over maybe from eastern Ukraine into Kazakhstan and across Russia. So this is the summer outlook overall. Again, since we are already into the summer, we can see how the trends are developing in the shorter term. We have some departures from this right now, so we're going to get into that here. But overall, again, the 3 months taken together, you can see where we expect the greatest issues potentially from heat and dryness and then more favorable weather. So moving forward, I'm going to start off with just a 10-day forecast across both Europe and the Black Sea, and we'll do temperatures and precipitation just to see. This is going to be our highest confidence portion of the forecast, just the shortest term that we have. So this will take us through early June through the first 10 days. We can see here that in Europe right now we're starting off very warm, so especially across Central Europe. Germany is the warmest in the forecast for the next 10 days. But overall, you see a warm picture for the first 10 days. And this is a bit different than the summer outlook at large. So this could mean that we trend cooler later, or we're already seeing some trends that might persist throughout the summer. I'll come back to that in just a bit. But right now, anyway, it does look warm for the next 10 days across Europe. Looking at rainfall in that pattern, here we have the accumulated rainfall on the left map and the departures from normal on the right-hand map. And so you can see here that we're expecting high rainfall across Western Europe, really France and Spain into Germany for the next 10 days there, and then dryness focused over Eastern and Northern Europe, so Poland and then Eastern Germany, the UK as well. Look to be dry the next 10 days or so. So again, this is just taking us through early June. That's what the pattern looks like. For the Black Sea, we actually see fairly moderate temperatures in the short term there. So the next 10 days, if anything, look cool across Ukraine and southern Russia, and then some warmer conditions expected over Kazakhstan overall. So that's what the temperature outlook looks like there. Again, cooler than the summer outlook, certainly. And looking at the rainfall pattern for the Black Sea region, we expect actually high rainfall for the next 10 days over, again, Ukraine and southern Russia, with drier conditions focused maybe to the north in Russia and also in Kazakhstan. So though this particular pattern highlights a few areas of concern that we're going to look at a little more closely now, based on areas that have already been dry and are vulnerable to more dryness moving forward. So overall, again, when you look across Europe and the Black Sea, any weather risks this summer look very regional in nature. That'll be a theme as I continue in this section. But there's a couple areas where you do have particular concern or vulnerability from a dry spring. And if we get any heat and dryness moving forward, things will quickly, the conditions will quickly deteriorate for crops in these areas. So one of those areas is the Russia-Volga district. So if you look at this area, the concern comes from low soil moisture. If you look at 2021 so far, every month we have set a 5-year low in soil moisture. The 5-year range is highlighted in this chart in the blue shading, and the red dots are what we've seen this year on a monthly basis so far. So January through April, we recorded 5-year low values in soil moisture for Russia-Volga. And then if we look at the 2-month rainfall pattern, this is going to be accumulated relative to normal. So the white line is normal, and the shading here is the accumulated rainfall that we've seen the last 2 months and up through the 10-day forecasts in this chart. And so you can see how it changes relative to normal. And overall, the last 2 months, it's been hovering around normal. And in the forecast, we're going to dip below normal and then maybe catch up near the end of the 10-day forecast. So it doesn't look bad, but certainly if dryness either intensifies relative to the current forecast or develops later, with this low soil moisture, you will quickly get concerns building in this portion of Russia. So that's one area to watch that is particularly vulnerable. Another one is Kazakhstan. Here again, we see 5-year lows or near it in soil moisture most of this year. And then looking toward rainfall, the chart looks much worse. The 2-month chart looks much worse. So we can see that ever since early April, we've had dryness intensifying across Kazakhstan to the point now that we're 20, 30 millimeters below normal. And the forecast in this case doesn't come anywhere close to catching us up to the normal line. So dryness will persist at least through early June in Kazakhstan. So here, again, the concern is both immediate and long-term that, any heat and dryness that we get, in which we're going to see some of, even in the short-term forecast, is going to bring negative consequences on crops quickly, again, as the crops develop through the summer, focusing on spring wheat for that area. So those are a couple areas of concern. I'm going to move on to sort of looking through mid and late June. This is going to be a more qualitative weather forecast that we have from our EC extended model. So this will be for the middle week of June and then the last full week of June. And the shading on this map, you'll have to look at the key, but I'll highlight the keys here, the key items to watch. So if we look at the middle of June, Europe, the main risk here looks to be dryness at this time. There's a sort of the dryness shading across much of the major grains areas of Europe in this map. If we look to late June, we don't see significant weather risks from this model at that time. There's some lingering dryness, but nothing too notable there. So again, fairly moderate weather as we get to the end of June from this model, but some dryness around the middle of the month. Europe is in such good shape from soil moisture and from generally moderate or even the weather of the cool spring that this is not overly alarming, but we do maybe expect a bit of a dry spell this month, from now in some areas from the short term into the middle of the month before things improve. If we look at the Black Sea region, here it looks like it will continue to be cool and wet, just as we see through 10 days, potentially cool and wet through the middle of June and then into the last week of June as well. This model shows persistently cool and wet conditions persisting or continuing across the Black Sea region, especially Ukraine and southern Russia. Moving to the east, we do see the potential for drier and warmer weather in Kazakhstan. So again, the area that we've seen the biggest concern from soil moisture, from past weather, and the short-term forecast also shows the greatest concern from this EC extended model through June. So the weather risks through June look to be focused in terms of negative risks on the Kazakhstan area, with better conditions across much of the Black Sea and Europe. Now, as we move through the summer, things will change, and there are certain. I'm going to show a few helpful tools that you can monitor, and these might tell you, are we seeing a shift from our summer outlook that things are changing in a different direction, or are things lining up well, or returning to the pattern that we showed at the beginning? There are different sort of teleconnections, we call them. They're forecast drivers that you can watch that operate on different time scales, but can support anomalous weather across Europe and the Black Sea. The first one is rooted in the Indian Ocean. It's called the Indian Ocean Dipole. This is sort of like ENSO, the El Nino Southern Oscillation, but it's focused in the Indian Ocean, and it is important for Europe and Black Sea weather. And it's just like ENSO that it has positive and negative phases. All of these forecast drivers will be this way. So I highlighted the zero line for the oscillation with red. And you can see in the forecast, we have values that go from January through the early portion of this year, and the blue dots are forecast values that go through the summer and beyond. And we can see that with this particular oscillation, we expect a positive phase event through the summer. This is part of the supporting evidence for the forecast that we made. So if I look at what that typically translates into for Europe and the Black Sea, we have these global weather anomaly maps in ICON that we can reference any time to look at how typical weather risks align with these different forecast drivers. So with the IOD, we typically see a warm pattern when it's in its positive phase. That's really across Europe and the Black Sea. And then we also see regional dryness focused over the Black Sea region. That part in particular is very much in line with our summer outlook, while the temperature pattern relies on some other factors that I'll get to in a moment. And then you do see the risks for high rainfall across much of Europe from this event. So again, you can see how if we do get a positive phase IOD as the forecast shows, that's how we got to the conclusion for this forecast, especially on the rainfall pattern. If the IOD were to trend negatively, you would see potentially a very different pattern, much cooler risks across the board, across both continents, and so forth. So that's a little bit of why the forecast looked how it did for the summer, and some issues to watch moving forward. Now getting to a couple other very key drivers for Europe and the Black Sea. The first one is the North Atlantic Oscillation. It's rooted in the Atlantic Ocean is where it's measured, and as is in the name. And again, it has a positive and negative phase. This one changes quickly. So if you look at the NAO through the last couple of months, you will see that throughout much of the spring, it was in its negative phase. Recently in May, it went into its positive phase, and it's expected to persist in its positive phase really through mid-June. Now, if we look at the summer overall, we have some seasonal forecasts that show the NAO is expected to be in its negative phase for the summer on balance. This is mostly from July, so this is suggesting that the summer outlook may reappear in terms of the pattern that we saw in the summer outlook. It may reappear once we get to July if the seasonal forecast for the NAO is correct. So let's take a look at what does the NAO typically bring. So if we have a negative NAO phase, this is what the summer weather pattern typically looks like. It's very similar to our summer outlook. So you see cool temperatures, cool temperature risks over Europe, very warm temperatures over the Black Sea, and then wet conditions in Europe and dryness over the Black Sea region. Again, so very much in line with our summer outlook, and we do expect the NAO to eventually trend negative for the summer on balance. So the forecast, again, the seasonal forecast lines up with our summer outlook. That's why those things are in unison. However, in the short term, the NAO is in its positive phase, which brings essentially the opposite weather pattern. So we see right now warm temperatures in Europe as opposed to coolness, and we see wet conditions in the Black Sea as opposed to dryness. So if our long-term expectations are correct, that will eventually reverse maybe into July, if not in June. So otherwise, if the NAO stays more positive throughout the summer, you could see a trend toward different outcome. The last thing I'll highlight here is the Arctic Oscillation. So similar to the NAO, it has negative and positive phases that can change, on a weekly basis or really even a day-to-day basis. So similar to the NAO, the Arctic Oscillation is going to be in its positive phase the next couple of weeks. However, throughout the summer, on balance, it's expected to be in its negative phase. So we'll see what that typically brings. In its negative phase, this one has a little bit of a weaker correspondence to our summer outlook overall, but you can see the general themes here. So it typically corresponds to cool temperatures in Europe, really moderate temperatures overall across all of Europe and the Black Sea, with dryness focused from Eastern Europe and Ukraine into Russia, and again, higher rainfall around that. So similar to the NAO, the AO is in its opposite phase right now to what we expect for the summer overall, which is why the weather in the short term looks very different than what we expect on the summer overall. So these are trends to watch. Again, if we see continuation of the current state, then the summer forecast, the summer weather overall will shift. However, if these flip once we get closer to July, then the risks will start to align more how our summer outlook looks as we get into some of the key development periods for the spring crops. So that's a little bit about some tools you can watch as we move forward. And just finishing up, summarizing what we've been through, the temperature outlook that we have for the summer. We expect heat risks over the Black Sea region with cooler conditions in Europe as likely. Precipitation, dryness risks evident across the Eurasia throughout the summer. Central Europe likely to be wetter than normal. Again, June through August overall. Some crop impacts from this. If we can see rains picking up soon in Russia, Volga, and Kazakhstan, that spring wheat could experience fairly widespread favorable weather this summer. Between the coolness in Europe with wet conditions there and some favorable weather maybe to the east across the Black Sea region, we could see some very positive impacts on wheat. But we do need to watch that issue with Kazakhstan, especially the dryness that's there. Needs to go away soon to see this outcome. And then corn impacts. We have potential heat and dryness in southern Europe and Ukraine in the long term, which would bring downside risks to corn, especially if that does develop in July. But it could be offset by better weather in Europe. That's a general theme from our weather outlook this summer in Europe and the Black Sea, is that you might have unfavorable weather in one region, but it looks very favorable elsewhere. And so, again, a lot of offsetting impacts. We don't expect significant downside crop risks overall across Europe or the Black Sea, just because everything looks regional in nature. So winter wheat, we're mostly focused on the harvest here. You could see some concerns with if it is persistently cool and wet in portions of Europe with the harvest there. But again, nothing major really to worry about. So some issues to watch moving forward. There's a lot of uncertainty in Europe on the temperature outlook because we have conflicting signals from the IOD to the NAO and Arctic Oscillation. They show different patterns on temperatures, so certainly there is high uncertainty there. And then the Black Sea, if we look there, we can see some things to watch if the IOD trends more negative, or we get continuation of what we're seeing right now with the NAO or the AO. With a positive phase this summer, then cooler and wetter conditions could develop there or continue from the short term throughout the summer. So those are issues to watch for potential changes as we move forward. And with that, I will pass it back to Levin.
Hello. Hi. Thanks, Isaac. I'll continue with the grain production forecast and supply and the demand outlooks. First of all, I wanted to introduce some methodologies that we adopt for crop production forecast. We take into account price data, satellite imagery, historical trends, weather data, government policy and field observations, build area and yield models using linear regression and advanced machine learning techniques. The goal is to provide reliable production forecast. First, let's look at the 2021-22 wheat production forecast. Here's the wheat production forecast and the supply analysis by Refinitiv. Here we look at the major wheat export countries in the world, including US, Russia, Ukraine, Argentina, EU, Australia, and Canada. The first column here is 2020-21 wheat production forecasted by Refinitiv. The second column is the total supply after taking into account the beginning stock for current season. And the third column is wheat production forecast for 2021-22 season. Here you can see in EU and Ukraine, wheat production is expected to increase from a year ago. At the same time, in Australia and Canada, we expect the wheat production return to a more normal level from last year's near record high. So the wheat production decrease in Australia and Canada may partially offset production gains in EU and Ukraine. So the total wheat production increase across these export countries will be only about 3 million tons over the next season. And then the total supply across these countries in 2021-22 will increase about 3.4 million tons. So this is the total supply. And then this is the domestic use. USDA projected domestic wheat yield across this country will increase about 4 million tons from current season. So the total supply will increase by about 3 million tons, but the domestic use will increase by 4 million tons. It means the wheat supply for export will decrease by about 1 million tons based on our current production forecast. And then look at the wheat demand for in the export market. Still, we look at the major export countries. The exports for the years prior to 2020-21 season customs data, which are available in ICON. For exports in 2020-21, we estimate export for 2020-21 based on our trade flow data. Here, I wanted to bring your attention is the Russia and Argentina wheat exports based on our trade flow data. We estimate Russia and Argentina wheat exports should be well below USDA's current projection, especially in Russia. Our trade flow data indicates Russia total wheat exports for current season will likely end at about 24 to 25 million tons, which is about 5 million tons below USDA's current projection. So based on our own export estimate for 2020-21, the total export are estimated at 158 million tons, close to the prior season. This is mainly because of the largely increased wheat exports to China. At the same time, exports to other destinations besides China are estimated to decrease by about 6 to 7 million tons. So move on to the next season, 2021-22. We estimate China wheat import will remain strong, but not as strong as current season. At the same time, export to other destinations besides China will increase to a more normal level because of the recovery of economies from the pandemic, potential recoveries. So based on these assumptions, we project 2021-22 total wheat exports across these export countries will be around 164 million tons, which is 6 million tons above current season. So the supply for export will decrease by about 1 million tons based on our current wheat production forecast, but the demand in the export market will increase by 6 million tons. So there's a 7 million tons gap between supply and the demand. So based on this global wheat supply and the demand analysis, we expect the global wheat supply over the next season will be tightened from current season. But again, there are some uncertainties in global wheat supply and the demand. First off, for Australia and Canada, crops are in pretty good shape so far because of the adequate soil moisture and favorable weather. So in Australia and Canada, these two countries have chances to harvest another bumper crop. If that happens, then Australia and Canada will supply more wheat into the global market. Again, right now in Russia, as Isaac just mentioned, there are some issues in the spring wheat area. Over the past 2 months, in the spring wheat area, it was a little bit warm and dry. Soil moisture is at the 5-year low, which is the limited yield potential for the spring wheat. We expect some rains over the next 10 days, but if the spring wheat area weather continues to be less favorable over the summer, then Russia wheat production could be affected. At the same time, the winter wheat area has been the weather in winter wheat area has been quite favorable, which could improve the winter wheat yield. So there's some uncertainties in Russia wheat production. But based on our current production forecast, we expect global wheat supply over the next season could be a little bit worse than current year. And then move on to the 2021-22 corn production forecast. This is a representative corn production forecast across the major corn export countries. Here in EU, we estimate the corn production at about 65 million tons, 1 million tons below last year. below last year's representative forecast, and Ukraine corn production will be around 34 million tons, 1.5 million tons above last year. And then here I wanted to bring your attention to U.S. and Brazil, Argentina corn production. Because of the high plantings in the U.S., corn production is estimated at 391 million tons, which is 31 million tons above last year. At the same time, Brazil corn production could reach 118 million tons, which is projected by USDA. We think that's quite normal if Brazil corn yield could reach a trend level. So you see here across U.S., Brazil, and Argentina, the corn production over the next season could increase largely from a year ago. The total corn production across this country could increase by about 53 million tons from 2020-21. And the total supply after taking into account the beginning stock could increase by about 30 to 40 million tons from a year ago. And then look at the corn exports across these major export countries, U.S., Brazil, Argentina, Ukraine. There's an increasing trend in total corn exports. For 2020-21 season, we project corn exports across these major export countries could reach 162 million tons, a large increase from a year ago. This is mainly due to the dramatic increase corn imports in China. At the same time, exports to other destinations are forecasted to decrease from a year ago. Move on to the next season, we estimate China corn import will remain strong, but not as strong as previous season. And so far, China corn production is estimated to about 107 million tons, which is about 9 million tons above last year. So higher corn production in China, and assuming the same amount of or slightly increased the consumption, it means the China corn import will be less than current season, but it's unlikely to return to the level prior to current season, like 4 to 5 million tons import. So based on this analysis, we projected 2021-22 season China corn, the total corn export across this country will be around 169 million tons, 7 million tons increase from current season. So you see the total supply will increase by about 30 to 40 million tons, but total demand in the export market will increase by about 7 million tons. So based on this analysis, we think the supply over the next season will be improved substantially in the corn market. But there are some uncertainties. First off, if U.S. corn production ends at as low as 381 million tons as projected by USDA in May, which is about 10 million tons below our current forecast, which means total corn supply in the global market could be only 20 to 30 million tons above current season, which is still a huge increase in terms of supply. Another uncertainty is Brazil corn production. Brazil corn yield is very vulnerable to weather conditions. If drought happens like what happened this year in southern Brazil, corn production in Brazil could be easily reduced by 20 to 30%. So if that happens, then corn supply in the global market could be tightened again. So this is about the corn supply and demand analysis and potential risks for corn supplies. Yeah, next I will hand it over to my colleague Worship for the trade flow analysis in Middle East and Africa.
Thank you, Libin. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. It appears the Middle East and Africa region is largely dependent on grains and oilseed imports to supplement local production. This dependence on international markets for grains and oilseeds is due to various factors such as relatively strong population growth in countries like Egypt and Nigeria, growing demand for animal feed in countries such as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Iran, changing consumption patterns in countries such as Kenya and Nigeria, relatively flat local crop production, for example, wheat production in Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria, scarce water resources limiting crop production, for instance, in Saudi Arabia. Due to these and other reasons, demand for food and animal feed is outpacing local production. As a result, imports are required to supplement the demand unmet by local production. This presentation takes a look at the imports of some of the countries in the Middle East and Africa amid the pandemic, which seems to be having different impacts across the region. As Egypt procures local wheat, our trade flows indicate the country's wheat imports during the first 11 months of the current marketing year totaled about 12 million tons, a 4% decline from the same period last year, but 4% above the 5-year average of 11.5 million tons. Buoyed by price competitiveness, the Black Sea countries accounted for almost 90% of Egypt's wheat imports during the same time frame. Generally, Egypt's wheat imports slowed down in Q4 as the country procures local wheat. As of 29 May 2021, Egypt bought 3.2 million tons of domestic wheat. Overall, Egypt aims to buy about 3.6 million tons of locally produced wheat, almost the same volume as the equivalent period last year. Meanwhile, Egypt's strategic wheat stocks are enough for about 6 months of consumption, that is according to the Egyptian government. On the other hand, the General Authority for Supply Commodities purchased 345,000 tons of Black Sea wheat and 240,000 tons of Romanian wheat for shipment in August this year. Our preliminary data is suggesting that Turkey's wheat imports for the 2020-2021 marketing year reached about 8.2 million tons, almost 25% decrease from the previous marketing year, but 25% above the 5-year average of 6.5 million tons. The Black Sea countries were responsible for about 90% of Turkey's wheat imports during the same season. As Sudan faces the pandemic and economic challenges, the country's wheat imports are 20% down during the first 11 months of the current season. In March 2021, the USDA announced an award to Sudan of 300,000 tons of US wheat under its fiscal year 2021 Food for Progress program. Meanwhile, our trade flows are forecasting 48,000 tons of US wheat to reach Sudanese shores this month. Despite facing similar challenges, Lebanon's wheat imports are up 12% to about 1.1 million tons during the same time frame, but 8% below the 3-year average of 1.2 million tons. Between July 2020 and May 2021, the Black Sea countries accounted for about 75% of Sudan and Lebanon's wheat imports. Similar to Sudan, Saudi Arabia's wheat imports are down by 21% to about 2.3 million tons during the first 11 months of the current season. However, more wheat shipments are expected into the next season as the Saudi Grains Organization bought about 1.2 million tons of wheat for shipment between May and December 2021. With suggestion that Nigeria is spending billions of dollars importing wheat, the Nigerian government expressed its desire to save scarce foreign currency by cutting the wheat import bill. However, our trade flows are suggesting that Nigeria's imports could reach about 5.6 million tons during the current season, 3% up from the previous season and 18% above the 3-year average of 4.7 million tons. Owing to soft demand because of the pandemic, Kenya's wheat imports are expected to reach about 2 million tons during the current season, a 13% decrease from the previous season. Likewise, South Africa's wheat imports are expected to reach about 1.15 million tons during the first 3 quarters of the current marketing year, a 5% decrease from the same period last year. Moving on to corn. Egypt imported about 7.5 million tons of corn during the first 8 months of the current marketing year, a 4% increase from the same period last year. In contrast, as Iran faces pandemic and sanctions-related challenges, Refinitiv trade flow models indicate Iran's corn imports during the first 8 months of the current season reached about 4.6 million tons, a 15% decrease from the same period last year, and 17% below the 3-year average of 5.6 million tons. Ukraine, Brazil, and Argentina were responsible for about 86% of Egypt's corn imports, while Brazil and the Black Sea countries accounted for about 92% of Iran's corn imports. Egypt's corn imports are largely driven by demand from the animal feed industry. Demand for animal feed from the aquaculture and poultry industries remains relatively strong. Egypt produces about 1.4 billion broilers per annum and is Africa's leading fish farming country, producing about 2 million tons of fish per annum. Yet, Egypt's corn production accounts for about 40% of its annual consumption of almost 17 million tons. Therefore, imports are required to supplement the demand unmet by local production. Meanwhile, our trade flow models are projecting Egypt to import almost 255,000 tons of corn and Iran to import about 225,000 tons of corn during the first 3 weeks of June. As the impact of the pandemic lingers on, Morocco's corn imports remain sluggish, while Turkey's corn imports remain flat. Thus, Turkey's corn imports totaled about 3.9 million tons during the first 3 quarters of the current season, the same import volume as the equivalent period last year. In Morocco, measures taken to slow down the spread of the COVID-19 last year led to a substantial decline in local demand for poultry meat and products, with the poultry sector losing more than $440 million. The poultry industry is the main consumer of imported corn. As a result, Morocco's corn imports reached about 2.9 million tons during the first 11 months of the current season, a 2% decrease from the same period last year. Between July 2020 and May 2021, Argentina and Brazil were the leading suppliers of corn to Morocco with a combined market share of 83%. Refinitiv trade flow models are forecasting 60,000 tons of Australian barley to reach Saudi Arabian shores during the first week of June, taking the country's total barley imports during the current season to almost 5.6 million tons. That's 11% above the total volumes of tenders issued by the Saudi Grains Organization during the same time frame. This suggests a move towards the deregulation of the Saudi barley market. Buoyed by the availability of exportable crop and price competitiveness, Russia and Australia dominated Saudi Arabia's year-to-date barley imports with a combined market share of almost 75%. Thus, Russia shipped about 2.44 million tons of barley to Saudi Arabia, while Australia exported about 1.62 million tons of barley to Saudi Arabia during the same period. Prior to these shipments, Australia last shipped about 66,000 tons of barley to Saudi Arabia in 2018-2019 season. In January 2020, Saudi Arabia made some changes to its animal feed subsidy program, which could potentially have a negative impact on demand for barley, as some farmers could switch to processed animal feed and forage. On the other hand, after reaching a historic high of almost 4.5 million tons last season, Saudi Arabia's corn imports, primarily used for animal feed production, are down by almost 30% to about 1.9 million tons during the first 8 months of the current season. Meanwhile, our models are forecasting Saudi Arabia to import almost 325,000 tons of Argentinian corn during the first half of June 2021. Now looking at our soybeans. Egypt and Turkey are among the fastest growing soybean markets in the Middle East and North Africa region, accounting for about 65% of the region's total soybean imports last season. The growth in soybean imports is largely driven by the local demand from the animal feed industry. On the other hand, local soybean production in these two countries accounts for less than 5% of their annual consumption. Therefore, Egypt's soybean imports during the first 8 months of the current season are up 11% up to about 3.4 million tons. In contrast, Turkey's soybean imports during the first 3 quarters of the current season reached about 1.8 million tons as of May 2021, a 14% decrease from the same period last year, but 4% above the 4-year average. Meanwhile, our trade flow models are focusing Turkey to import about 470,000 tons of soybeans during the first half of June, and Egypt to import about 465,000 tons of soybean during the first 3 weeks of June. After reaching a historic high of 1.1 million tons in 2020, Kenya's year-to-date palm oil imports are 25% down to about 294,000 tons. However, imports could pick up during the second half of the season as they account for more than 90% of the country's total veg oils and fats consumption. Even though South Africa is the leading producer of oilseeds in Southern Africa, it does not produce palm oil. Palm oil imports are an integral supplement in the South African market and account for almost 40% of the total local vegetable oil consumption of about 1.3 million tons. Refinitiv data is showing South Africa's year-to-date palm oil imports reached about 166,000 tons, almost the same volume as the equivalent period last year. Turkey's year-to-date palm oil imports for the current marketing year reached about 460,000 tons as of May 2021, a 28% increase from the same period last year. Buoyed by favorable import duty, Malaysia was responsible for about 90% of Turkey's palm oil imports during the same time frame. With that, I'll take it back to my colleagues, either Lepin or Julia. Thank you for listening.
Worship, thank you very much for your presentation. Yes, we have a couple of questions from our audience. So the first one is if we're going to share slides and also if we're going to share the presentations, they're recording itself, yes, or the recording and also the slides will be shared within upcoming few days. Another question is the next one. So I'm hearing that La Nina will come back during Q4. What is your feeling about it? I guess this question should go to Isaac. Isaac, will you be able to cover this question?
Yes, I'm happy to address that question. Actually, it's funny, I've been working on our first forecast for ENSO during Q4 in the recent days. So I can comment directly here. So we're taking a look at this, and the best expectations we have from what we're seeing is for the neutral state as most likely to continue. However, the risk is toward La Nina. So we're going to be forecasting technically a neutral negative ENSO state for September to November. Now that doesn't include December, so we could get more trends looking beyond September to November. But right now we expect a neutral state that leans toward the direction of La Nina, and so you could take from that the risk overall is toward La Nina. However, I will say from looking at our analog years and influencers on the forecast, at this stage, it's a really high uncertainty situation for later this year. All pathways are still possible. It's not impossible that El Nino could develop yet. However, it is more likely that we would head toward La Nina. So that's the more likely direction, but we do expect neutral conditions as most likely during that time right now.
Thank you, Isaac. Another question, any stats on interregional trade within East Africa or West Africa? I guess this question should go to Worship. Worship, could you please comment on this, if you can, of course?
Yes, we do have some statistics, but they vary from commodity to commodity in terms of their level of completeness and availability, but yes, we do.
Okay, thank you. Another question, what is the significance of Egyptian soybean imports? Worship, I guess it's also for you.
So the because of the demand that is coming from the animal feed industry, especially being driven by the agriculture and poultry industries, there's a huge demand for soybeans in Egypt, and Egypt is sort of increased its crushing capacity at the same time. So it's like a market that is growing fast due to the strong demand. At the same time, the food processing industry is also benefiting from the increased crushing capacity in terms of soybean oil consumption.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And we still have 5 minutes before the end of the webinar, so we're able to answer some additional questions. So another one, why did Europe, Eurasia have such a cool spring, and are the same factors in play for this summer? So I guess it should go to Isaac. Isaac, could you please comment? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. This spring, and I commented briefly on it in the presentation, we had when I covered the forecast drivers, very important for Europe and the Black Sea is that North Atlantic Oscillation, and that particular driver was strongly in a negative phase event throughout the spring, which across the region does support the outcome that we saw, the very cool season that was observed there. And again, as I mentioned in our forecast for the summer, we do expect, it's not the case right now. Right now we went into a positive phase NAO for the next couple of weeks at least, and maybe for June overall, we'll see as we go forward. But we do expect the return of a negative phase NAO and related drivers that would bring similar consequences for Europe. Again, not so similar in the Black Sea. It typically would be warmer there with a negative NAO. But so that's a little bit of explanation of what happened in the spring. And some of the same factors are in play, at least for Europe for the summer, maybe less so in the Black Sea from looking maybe out to July and August.
Thank you. And I guess the last two ones. So first one, do you think China will continue to import large amount of USA corn over the next season? Lidbeen, could you please comment on this? Thank you.
For China corn import, as I mentioned during the presentation, we estimate China corn import will unlikely to go back to the low levels before, current season. Before this year, China used to import 4 to 5 million tons of corn from Ukraine, but this year China is estimated to import about 30 million tons of corn, mainly from Ukraine and the United States. From United States, the import would be about 23 million tons, and based on the latest data, U.S. already shipped 15 million tons of corn to China. The market was talking about the cancellation of, corn sales to China, but so far we didn't see any significant cancellation. And just over the past month, May, U.S. just delivered 3 million tons of corn to China, which is a record high exports, record high monthly exports. So there are also 8 million tons of corn for deliveries over the next 3 months. 3 months, which is quite reasonable if China continues. I mean, the delivery pace continues to be as strong as the past 2 months. Then, the total exports to China will likely remain at will likely reach the projected export of 23 million tons. Over the next season, as I mentioned, China corn production will increase by about 9 to 10 million tons, which will, to some extent, lower the demand for the international corn in the international market. But China has continued to increase its corn consumption, and the state reserve of corn has been depleted. So it will have, a strong demand for the corn in the international market. So we estimate China corn import will remain strong, but maybe lower than current season because of the increased production and China government's intention of reduce corn consumption. Yeah, I saw a question about the Russia wheat export. Here, I wanted to explain a little bit about this question. Based on our own production forecast, last season, Russia wheat production is about 79 million tons. The raw stats estimate is about 85, 86 million tons, but based on the wheat export data in Russia, we don't think production could be as high as the 86 million tons projected by USDA and raw stats. Also, based on our trade flow data, are the vessel level lineups data. We sum up the monthly and the annual export in Russia. So far, since last July, we checked 33.7 million tons of wheat export, not including the transshipments. Only the export to other countries. So the total export we checked so far is 33.7 million tons. We also have a customs data. The customs data from July through March is about 33.4 million tons, which is a little bit higher than our trade flow data if compared to the export during the same period. But we all know in April and May, the wheat exports in Russia has declined substantially because of the extra wheat tariff for wheat exports. So based on the customs data, the total export through May should be around 34.7, or less than 35 million tons. So I don't know what's 35.5 million tons. Where did you get this number? But based on our trade flow data and the customs data, the export through May is about less than 35 million tons. June export is still unknown, but based on our trade flow, the lineup data seems like June export won't be, significantly higher than previous several months. So the wheat export in Russia is definitely much lower than USDA's current projection. And we think that the lower export also indicates less wheat production for previous season as projected by USDA and the Rosstat.
Thank you, Libin. Dear all, I would like to thank you all for joining us today. We'd really appreciate this. And I also would like to thank you, our speakers, and we're closing our today's webinar. Thank you and have a lovely evening or afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.